The courtroom was wrapped in a tense, suffocating silence. Sergeant Ethan Carter sat in the center, his hands cuffed in front of him. His military uniform, adorned with medals that testified to his years of service and sacrifice, felt out of place in the hostile atmosphere. Convicted of murdering 2 civilians during a military mission, Ethan had already resigned himself to his fate, the electric chair. His once proud eyes were now hollow, reflecting only the acceptance of the inevitable. But today, for the first time in weeks, Ethan raised his head and spoke. "I have one last request," he began, his voice steady but strained with emotion. "Before my sentence is carried out, I'd like to see my partner, Jagger, one final time." The mention of the name caused a ripple through the room. Jagger wasn't just a dog. He was Ethan's K-9 partner, a Belgian Malinois who had served alongside him on some of the most dangerous missions overseas. The bond between them was legendary, built on loyalty and survival. The judge, clearly caught off guard, adjusted his glasses and hesitated. "Sergeant Carter, this court doesn't have a precedent for something like this." "I'm not sure I can." Before he could finish, Captain Emma Wilson, a former colleague of Ethan's, stood from the back of the room. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "Jagger is a veteran too. He risked his life for this country, just like Ethan. Denying this request would be inhumane." The tension in the courtroom hung heavy as the judge considered her words. After a moment, he sighed and relented. "Very well. This court grants the request under strict supervision. You will have 10 minutes with the dog, no more." The decision brought a wave of quiet murmurs through the crowd. Ethan, still cuffed, closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. He didn't know what to expect from the reunion, but he knew he needed to say goodbye to the one being who had never judged him. As he was led to a private room, each step felt heavier than the last. And then he heard it. The sound of claws clicking on the floor, the faint jingle of a collar. The door opened, and there he was, Jagger. The dog didn't hesitate. With purpose and determination, Jagger moved toward his partner, placing his paws on Ethan's chest. Ethan, a man who had withstood explosions, bullets, and the horrors of war, crumbled. Tears streamed down his face as he cradled Jagger's face in his hands. "You never gave up on me, did you, boy?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Jagger let out a soft whine, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's face as if he could sense the weight of his pain. And in that moment, something shifted in Ethan. A memory buried and forgotten began to surface. A detail from the night that had sealed his conviction. Something he hadn't noticed before. Something that might prove his innocence. Ethan sat on the cold metal chair, his hands trembling as he ran them through Jagger's thick fur. The dog's presence brought a rare moment of calm to his storm of despair, but his mind was racing. That memory, faint, fragmented, was clawing its way back to the surface. It was the night of the ambush, the mission that had gone terribly wrong and left him holding the blame. He closed his eyes, gripping Jagger's collar for grounding, as flashes of that chaotic night returned to him. The sounds of gunfire, the shouts of his team, and the metallic tang of blood in the air. They were all vivid, as if it had happened yesterday. And then there was a voice, one he hadn't remembered before, shouting something that didn't make sense at the time. It had been a setup. Ethan's heart raced as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The night of the operation, someone on his team had given false coordinates, deliberately. He hadn't pieced it together until now, but the details aligned too perfectly to ignore. Someone had lured them into that trap, knowing the civilians would be caught in the crossfire. But who? And why? Ethan's breathing quickened as he looked down at Jagger. The dog stared back at him with those familiar, steady eyes, as if urging him to focus. Before Ethan could gather his thoughts, the guard at the door cleared his throat. 5 minutes left, he announced gruffly, shattering the fragile moment of clarity. Ethan's chest tightened. 5 minutes wasn't enough. Not to process what he'd just uncovered, not to say goodbye to Jagger, and certainly not to figure out a way to prove his innocence. But as Jagger nuzzled closer to him, Ethan realized something crucial. The dog might hold the key. Jagger had been there that night, His training as a military K-9 meant he'd been outfitted with a camera attached to his vest, recording every second of the mission. "Jagger," Ethan whispered, his voice shaky but resolute. His mind raced with the possibilities. If the footage still existed, it could show what really happened that night. Could prove that Ethan hadn't fired the fatal shots. But retrieving it wouldn't be easy. Jagger had been reassigned after the trial, and any evidence from that night would have been locked away or buried deep in military archives. "You might be the only one who can save me," Ethan said, his voice breaking. Jagger let out a soft bark, his ears perking up as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The door opened abruptly, and 2 guards stepped in. "Time's up," one of them said curtly, his expression indifferent. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he knew there was no room for protest. As the guards approached, Ethan placed his forehead against Jagger's, closing his eyes. "I'll figure it out, buddy. I promise," he murmured. The guards pulled Jagger away, the dog resisting with soft whines and glances back at Ethan. As the door closed, leaving Ethan alone in the cold, lifeless room, a flicker of determination burned in his chest. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find that footage. He had no other choice. The walls of Ethan's cell were closing in on him. The dim, flickering light overhead cast long shadows across the cement floor, but he barely noticed it anymore. His mind was consumed by one thing: the footage from Jagger's vest. If it still existed, it was buried deep within the military's archives, locked away under layers of bureaucracy. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Sitting on the edge of his cot, he stared at the faint scratch marks on the wall, his own desperate attempts to mark the days since his conviction. It hit him now, more than ever, how close he was to running out of time. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Captain Emma Wilson. She was the only person he could think of who might help him. Emma had been a loyal colleague, one of the few who didn't turn her back on him during the trial. She had spoken up for him in the courtroom, vouching for his character when no one else would. If anyone could dig into the archives and find that footage, it was her. But how could he reach her? Inmates on death row didn't exactly have free access to phones, and every word he said was monitored. Still, Ethan knew he had to try. Later that day, Ethan sat in the visitation room, waiting for the guard to return with a phone. He had managed to convince them that he needed to make a final call, a privilege granted to those on death row. When the phone was finally placed in front of him, he wasted no time dialing Emma's number. The line rang twice before her familiar voice came through. "Hello?" she said cautiously, the noise of papers rustling in the background. Ethan's grip tightened on the receiver. "Emma, it's me, Ethan." There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath on her end. "Ethan, how did you even get access to call me?" she asked, her voice laced with both shock and concern. "There's no time to explain," Ethan said quickly, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. Jagger's camera from the night of the mission. Do you think it still exists? The footage could prove I didn't fire those shots." Silence hung between them, and Ethan's heart pounded as he waited for her response. Finally, Emma sighed. "I don't know, Ethan. After the trial, a lot of evidence was classified or destroyed. But if it's anywhere, it would be in the secure evidence vault at the base." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Emma, please. You're the only one I trust. If there's a chance it's still there, I need you to find it." Emma hesitated, but then her tone shifted, firm with resolve. "Okay, I'll look into it, but Ethan, this won't be easy. If they find out what I'm doing, my career is over. You understand that, right?" Ethan swallowed hard, guilt and gratitude washing over him. "I know, Emma. I wouldn't ask if I had another choice." Before she could say anything else, the guard motioned for him to hang up. "I have to go," he said quickly. "Thank you. And Emma, be careful." As he handed the phone back and was escorted to his cell, a small spark of hope ignited in his chest. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe there might be a way out of this nightmare. Emma paced the dimly lit corridors of the military base, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been stationed here for years, but tonight, the familiar hallways felt like enemy territory. Every step echoed louder than the last, and every shadow seemed to hold a pair of prying eyes. She clutched the keycard tightly in her hand, knowing that one wrong move could not only end her career, but also land her in prison. Yet, as she thought about Ethan's voice on the phone, desperate but determined, she knew she couldn't back out now. The evidence vault was located in a secure wing of the base, behind multiple layers of locked doors and surveillance cameras. Emma had carefully planned her approach, timing her movements to avoid the night patrol. She swiped her card at the first checkpoint and held her breath as the scanner processed. A green light blinked, and the door clicked open. So far, so good. She stepped inside, the sterile smell of metal and cold air hitting her immediately. Rows of lockers stretched before her, each containing fragments of missions long past, classified and forgotten. Somewhere in this room was the footage from Jagger's vest. Emma moved quickly, scanning the tags on the lockers. Her eyes darted from one label to the next, searching for the mission designation from that fateful night. Her fingers trembled as she finally spotted it. Operation Dawnstrike. She paused, her breath hitching in her throat. Pulling open the drawer, she rifled through the contents, files, photographs, and, finally, a small, dust-covered hard drive. She held it up, her hands shaking. This was it. This tiny device could hold the truth Ethan needed. But as she slipped it into her jacket pocket, the sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. A flashlight beam swept across the floor outside the vault door. Emma's heart raced as she pressed herself against the wall, the hard drive burning in her pocket. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the murmur of two voices. "I thought I heard something down here," one of the guards said. Emma held her breath, her mind racing. If they found her here, there would be no way to explain her presence. She glanced at the back of the room and spotted a maintenance hatch, her only chance. Silently, she crept toward it, her boots barely making a sound against the floor. She pushed the hatch open just as the vault door began to creak. Sliding into the narrow passage, Emma pulled the hatch closed behind her and crawled through the cramped space, her heart pounding in her ears. She emerged into the cool night air outside the base, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The hard drive was safe, but the danger was far from over. She knew decrypting the footage would be another battle entirely, one that would require both time and discretion. As she walked toward her car, the weight of what she had just done settled on her shoulders. She had crossed a line tonight, and there was no turning back. Emma sat in her car, parked in a desolate lot miles from the base. The glow from her laptop illuminated her face as she connected the hard drive to the device. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a moment. She knew what was at stake. If this drive didn't contain the footage, everything she had risked would be for nothing. She exhaled deeply and clicked on the first file. The screen flickered, and the grainy video began to play. The familiar image of Jagger's perspective appeared, his camera capturing the chaos of that fateful night. The sound of gunfire erupted through the speakers, and Emma flinched. The footage showed Ethan's team moving through a crumbling building, their voices urgent but steady as they called out positions. She watched as Jagger darted ahead, his body low to the ground, scanning for threats. Suddenly, a figure in civilian clothing appeared in the frame, and the screen filled with shouts. Ethan's voice rising above the others. "Hold fire! Civilians!" Emma's heart sank as the next sequence unfolded. Shots rang out, but they weren't coming from Ethan. The angle of the camera shifted, and in the chaos, a shadowy figure raised their weapon and fired directly at the civilians. Emma paused the video, her stomach twisting. She rewound the footage and watched again, this time focusing on the shooter. The grainy image made it difficult to see the face clearly, but the outline of their uniform was unmistakable. It was someone from Ethan's own team. Her hands clenched into fists. Ethan had been telling the truth all along. He hadn't fired the fatal shots. He had been framed. But why? And by whom? Emma stared at the screen, her mind racing. She needed a clearer look at the shooter's face to expose the truth, but she also knew that any attempt to enhance the footage would draw attention. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was an unknown number, but she knew better than to ignore it. She answered cautiously. "Hello." A deep, stern voice came through the line. "Captain Wilson, this is Colonel Briggs. I need to speak with you immediately." Emma's blood ran cold. How had they found out so quickly? "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, keeping her tone as neutral as possible. "We've been notified of unusual activity in the evidence vault," Briggs said sharply. "Report to my office at 0700 hours. This isn't optional." The line went dead before she could respond. Emma gripped the steering wheel, her mind spinning. She was running out of time. The military was already closing in, and she hadn't even told Ethan what she had found. She needed to act fast, but she couldn't do it alone. Her only option was to get the footage to someone outside the military, someone who could help bring the truth to light. As she stared at the laptop, the image of Jagger frozen on the screen, a single thought crystallized in her mind. This wasn't just about saving Ethan. It was about exposing a betrayal buried deep within the system. The early morning air was crisp as Emma parked her car outside a small diner on the edge of town. The sun had barely risen, and the place was quiet, save for a lone trucker nursing a coffee by the window. Emma clutched the hard drive tightly in her hand as she walked inside, her eyes scanning the room. Sitting at a booth in the corner was the only person she trusted enough to help. Ryan Blake, a former investigative journalist who had been discharged from the military for digging too deeply into corruption. Ryan looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Emma," he asked, lowering his coffee cup. "You're the last person I expected to call me." Emma slid into the seat across from him, placing the hard drive on the table. "I need your help," she said bluntly. "This drive contains footage that proves Ethan Carter didn't kill those civilians. But if I take it through official channels, it'll disappear, just like everything else they've tried to bury." Ryan raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "You realize what you're asking, right? If this footage is as explosive as you say, the people protecting it won't hesitate to silence us. Permanently. I don't have a choice." Emma shot back, her voice trembling. "Ethan has days left, maybe less. This footage is his only chance, and I can't do this alone." Ryan studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning her face. Finally, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. I know someone who can enhance the footage and get it out to the right people, but it won't be easy. We'll need to get past military firewalls to access the original logs, or they'll claim it's been tampered with." Emma nodded, her jaw set. "Then let's get started." The two of them drove to a safe house Ryan had been using, a rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, its windows covered with blackout curtains. Inside, Ryan set up his equipment. Multiple monitors, encrypted connections, and a series of tools Emma couldn't begin to understand. As he worked on enhancing the footage, Emma paced the room, her nerves on edge. Minutes felt like hours as the video played on repeat, the blurry image of the shooter haunting her. Finally, Ryan paused the footage and pointed to the screen. "There," he said, zooming in. The image sharpened slightly, revealing the shooter's face. Emma gasped. It was Lieutenant Greg Harlow, a man Emma and Ethan had both served with. The realization hit her like a freight train. Harlow had always been ambitious, willing to cut corners to climb the ranks, but she never imagined he would go this far. "It was him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's the one who set Ethan up." Ryan nodded grimly. "And if he's involved, you can bet there are others covering for him. This goes deeper than just one man." Emma's mind raced as she thought about what to do next. Harlow had connections, power, and the resources to bury them both if he found out what they knew. But for Ethan's sake, she couldn't back down now. Emma's hands shook as she stared at the screen, the grainy but unmistakable image of Lieutenant Greg Harlow frozen in the frame. She had trusted him once. They all had. The realization of his betrayal left a bitter taste in her mouth, but there was no time to dwell on it. Ryan stood, already pulling on his jacket. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "If Harlow or anyone else in his circle knows what we've uncovered, they'll come after us." Emma nodded, shoving the hard drive into her bag. The clock was ticking, and Ethan's life hung in the balance. They decided to split up. Ryan would reach out to his contact, a tech expert who could help them hack into the military's database to pull the original mission logs. Meanwhile, Emma would try to find someone high enough in the chain of command to take the evidence seriously, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated by Harlow's influence. It was a risky plan, but it was their only shot. "Be careful," Ryan said as they parted ways in the alley behind the apartment. "We're playing a dangerous game." Emma gave a curt nod, her face set with determination. "I'll be in touch." Emma drove to the outskirts of the city, her mind racing as she considered her options. She needed someone with integrity, someone who valued justice over politics. One name came to mind: General Marcus Ellison, a decorated officer known for his unshakable sense of duty. She had met him once during her early years of service and remembered him as a man who didn't tolerate corruption. Pulling up to a secure military base, she took a deep breath before presenting her credentials to the guard at the gate. "I need to speak with General Ellison," she said firmly. "It's a matter of life and death." After a tense wait in the lobby, Emma was escorted into a small office where the general sat behind a desk cluttered with reports and medals. He looked up, his stern face softening slightly when he recognized her. "Captain Wilson," he said, motioning for her to sit. "What brings you here under such unusual circumstances?" Emma wasted no time, pulling the hard drive from her bag and placing it on his desk. "Sir, this contains evidence that proves Sergeant Ethan Carter is innocent. But it also implicates Lieutenant Harlow in the deaths of 2 civilians. I need your help to make sure this gets where it needs to go." Ellison's expression darkened as he leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the hard drive. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a court-martial case. It's a cover-up." He exhaled slowly, his fingers steepled in thought. "You understand the risk you're taking by bringing this to me?" Emma met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Yes, sir. But I'd rather risk everything than let an innocent man die for something he didn't do." Ellison studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Leave it with me. I'll verify the evidence and do what I can." Emma stood, relief washing over her. But as she walked out of the office, a chilling thought struck her. If Ellison couldn't be trusted, all of this would have been for nothing. Ethan sat on his cot, staring at the wall. Hours dragged by in silence, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. His mind raced with doubt. Had Emma found anything, or had her efforts been in vain? His heart ached as he thought of Jagger, the last connection to the life he once had. But no word had come. He clenched his fists, trying to hold on to the faint glimmer of hope Emma had sparked. Still, with the clock ticking toward his execution, hope felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Emma sat in her car outside the base, her stomach twisting in knots. She hadn't heard from General Ellison since handing over the hard drive hours earlier. Should she go back inside? Her gut told her to wait. But for how long? Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She grabbed it, expecting Ellison, but froze at the sound of Lieutenant Harlow's voice. "Captain Wilson," he said coolly. "I hear you've been busy." Her heart dropped. "What do you want, Harlow?" she snapped. He chuckled darkly. "I want you to stop. Walk away before you dig yourself in deeper." The line went dead before she could respond. The call left her breathless. Harlow knew. Worse, he sounded confident, like he was already pulling the strings to shut her down. Panic surged as Emma started her car and sped back toward the base. She needed to warn Ellison. As she approached, she spotted 2 unmarked SUVs parked near the entrance, flanked by men in suits. Her stomach churned. These weren't Ellison's men. They were here for him or the evidence. Emma's instincts screamed at her to turn around, and she did, gripping the wheel tightly as she sped off. Desperate, Emma called Ryan. "Harlow knows everything," she said the moment he picked up. "They're moving fast, and Ellison might already be compromised." Ryan cursed under his breath. "We need to act now. Get to the safe house," he said. "If they're this desperate, it means we've got something real. We need to get that footage out to the public before they bury it." "And us," Emma agreed, her heart pounding. Time was running out, and the stakes were higher than ever. As she drove, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of headlights following her in the distance. Her pulse quickened. The game had shifted, and now it wasn't just about saving Ethan. It was about staying alive long enough to expose the truth. Emma kept glancing in her rearview mirror, her nerves fraying as the headlights stayed locked on her car. Her mind raced. If Harlow's men were following her, it meant they were closing in fast. She made a sharp turn down a side road, cutting through back alleys and quiet streets in a desperate attempt to lose them. Her hands tightened on the wheel, sweat gathering at her temples. For a brief moment, the headlights disappeared, and she exhaled shakily. But the relief was short-lived. The lights reappeared, closer this time. Whoever they were, they weren't giving up. She pressed harder on the gas, weaving through the city, until she spotted the entrance to an old industrial complex. Without thinking twice, Emma swerved into the lot, the gravel crunching loudly beneath her tires. She killed the engine and slipped out of the car, clutching the bag with the hard drive tightly to her chest. Ducking behind a rusted shipping container, she listened as the pursuing vehicle rolled into the lot and came to a stop. Doors slammed, and she heard heavy footsteps approaching. Her heart pounded in her ears as she crouched lower, every muscle in her body tensed. Spread out, a voice barked, authoritative and cold. Emma peeked through a gap in the container, spotting 3 men in dark suits, each armed. One of them held a flashlight, sweeping it across the lot. She clutched the hard drive tighter, her breath shallow. She needed to get out, but the men were too close. The only way was to wait for an opening. A sound broke the silence, a metal clang from the far side of the lot. One of the men turned sharply. "Over there," he said, motioning the others to follow. Emma didn't know what caused the noise, but she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. As soon as they moved, Emma bolted toward the far end of the lot, keeping low and darting between abandoned equipment. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. She reached the edge of the complex and slipped through a hole in the fence, emerging onto a quiet street. Her car was gone now, likely taken by the men, but she didn't care. She sprinted down the street until she reached a small gas station. Pulling out her phone, she dialed Ryan. He picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" he asked urgently. "I'm not sure," she admitted, breathless. "But they found me. I barely got away." Ryan's tone was grim. "You need to stay moving. Meet me at the old train depot on the west side of town. It's isolated, and we can figure out our next move there." Emma nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'll be there," she said before hanging up. As she began walking, her body still trembling, she realized just how dangerous this had become. Harlow and his men weren't just trying to bury the truth. They were hunting her. She pulled the hard drive closer, silently vowing to see it through. Ethan's life depended on it, and now so did hers. The old train depot was eerily quiet, bathed in the faint orange glow of the distant streetlights. Emma slipped inside through a broken door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Ryan was already there, hunched over a laptop set up on an old wooden crate. His face was illuminated by the screen, a mix of focus and exhaustion etched into his features. "You made it," he said, relief evident in his voice. Emma nodded, setting the hard drive down next to him. "Barely," she replied, her voice tight. "They're on our heels, Ryan. We don't have much time." Ryan plugged in the hard drive and began typing furiously, pulling up the footage and the enhanced image of Harlow. "This is it," he said, glancing at her. "We send this out now, news outlets, whistleblower sites, everywhere. Once it's public, they can't erase it." Emma hesitated, her hands trembling. "Are you sure this will be enough?" Ryan gave her a hard look. "Once the world sees this, Harlow won't be able to hide. And if Ellison's still on our side, he can pressure the military to act." Emma took a deep breath and nodded. "Do it." As Ryan hit the final key, the files began uploading. The seconds stretched into eternity as the progress bar crept forward. Just as the upload reached 95%, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the stillness. Emma's heart dropped. "They found us," she whispered. Ryan cursed under his breath, grabbing a handgun from his bag. "Keep them away from the laptop," he said, standing and moving toward the entrance. Emma positioned herself near the crate, clutching a wrench she had found nearby. Her pulse raced as the first shadow appeared in the doorway. The next few moments were a blur of shouts and chaos. One of Harlow's men stepped inside, his weapon raised, but Ryan fired first, forcing the intruder to take cover. Emma ducked as another man fired a shot that ricocheted off the metal beams above her. The laptop beeped, a final, triumphant sound. The upload was complete. "It's done," Ryan shouted, but his relief was cut short when a third man lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. Emma rushed forward, swinging the wrench with all her strength. The man collapsed, and Ryan scrambled back to his feet. As sirens wailed in the distance, Emma and Ryan exchanged a look of relief. The cavalry was coming, but so was the fallout. The footage had gone live, exposing Harlow and proving Ethan's innocence. Days later, Ethan's conviction was overturned, and Harlow was arrested, though the damage of his betrayal would leave scars for years to come. In the quiet aftermath, Emma stood outside the prison gates as Ethan stepped into the sunlight, Jagger bounding toward him. Ethan knelt, burying his face in the dog's fur. "I told you I'd figure it out," he murmured. Emma watched, tears in her eyes, knowing they had all fought for this moment, and won.